Good afternoon. It's Friday, the 8th of January 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, deep behind the technical desk, is Mike Robinson. And we're going to be joined today by Vanessa Veely, who will be talking to Mike principally about the situation in Syria and claims that thousands of people are now starving. We'll also be joined by David Scott from Northern Exposure. David will, amongst other things, be updating us on the weather in Scotland. On that very note, here in Plymouth, it's not too bad at all. Cold, but bright blue skies. We've got the same in Brighton, the same in Norfolk. Rhyl is looking good as well. Fortunately, we've been told by Vanessa that France is, well, in her location at least, is miserable. We're happy at that because, of course, we like to see the bad weather shared around. Well, let's kick off by just reminding people the court case is taking place at the moment, and this is to do with the so-called Nottingham Six. It's the people who were involved around Tom Crawford's affair, and they're appearing in court, including Tom's son, Craig. Well, according to the local press, it's all really now being watered down. This is just people getting behind with their mortgage, having their house repossessed. And when they try and do something about it, they've been intimidating those very nice, kind bailiffs and security people. So outrageous reporting, or lack of it, by the Nottinghamshire Post. We'll wait for a further report about what actually happens in the court case. But of course, meanwhile, UK Column is receiving more and more information, factual information and evidence about the vast fraud of mortgages and, of course, the international banking cartels behind them. So stay posted for that. Well, if you want to know who's certainly in bed with the bankers, and JP Morgan in particular, we need look no further than this man, Tony Blair, grinning from ear to ear with an increasingly satanic smile, in my opinion at least. And he's very happy because Windrush Ventures Limited, his main company, has reported an operating profit of £2.6 million, and that's up a mere £812,000 from last year, as you do when you mix with the world's powerful and elitist people. And I understand that Tony's been very, very grateful. He's given some of that money to his staff. I think some of them have had £30,000 bonuses. Now, what does he do? Well, here he is. He's working through a network of companies. Abu Dhabi Executive Affairs Authority, China Investment Corporation. He's an advisor to Kazakhstan, another country with excellent human rights records. He's into Brazil, he's into Kuwait, and apparently he's working up deals in Asia and Latin America. And he's also helped one of the biggest mergers in 2012 between mining giant Glencore, Int PLC and Xstrata. Well, don't worry, because he says what he's really doing is not making money. It's about making a difference in the world. If he really needed to make money, he could do it in a lot simpler way. So well done, Bloomberg Business, at least, because they clearly are keeping tabs on Tony. Now, Tony Blair, the same man who, when he wasn't doing such charitable work, was unleashing wars in Iraq in particular. And that leads us nicely into the subject of Syria. Have we got Vanessa live?
Well, we do. Hello, Vanessa.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Okay, so, sorry, we're going to be talking about Madaya today because this story has been breaking over the last 4 or 5 days. And apparently everyone is starving to death there. According to The Guardian here, they're saying that residents of a Syrian town a few dozen miles from the capital, Damascus, say they're dying of starvation as a result of a months-long siege by forces loyal to the governments of Bashar al-Assad. Families are eating leaves, grasses and water flavoured with spices in the town of Madaya, where rice is sold by the gram because a kilogram costs as much as £170. Some have killed and eaten their pets. Other activists inside the town also shared pictures of starving children, one being pushed in a buggy far too small for him because he was too weak to walk. Now, we'll come on to the photos in a moment. Now, here is a map of the area just to show you where it is we're talking about, not far from the Lebanese border. Vanessa, it's extremely difficult to understand who all the players in this game are. Could you, in a nutshell, give us an overview of who's living in Madaya, who's besieging them, what's behind this, what's the background? And because the Guardian's saying that this is a month-long siege and people have been suffering for months, but we're only beginning to hear about it now. So what's really going on here?
Well, this is another incredible demonstration of how these days, for many years now, the mainstream media is nothing more than a prostitute ring for the imperialist pimps, because we saw them, we have to take into account how rapidly this propaganda was inflamed, fueled, and spread. And we are now seeing, we saw yesterday Vice, for example, remove or correct their article and publish an apology because they used fake photographs from 2013.
Right, so hold on a second. Here are some of the photographs that you sent me earlier. Now, these are tweets that have been doing the rounds of Twitter, and this particular set of images sent to Ben Affleck, who then was retweeting it on, for example. And on the right-hand side, we discover that these photographs were originally from when? 2013 or something like that? And here we've got another one which was doing the rounds on Twitter, and I believe this one was one of the ones that Vice published, but we find that this, in fact, was originally published on a website in April 2015, and more of the same. And this one, Vice actually tweeted this one out, and as you say, this was the original article that Vice posted, and they then had to issue a retraction, a correction. A previous version of this story contained photos purporting to show malnourished children in Madaya. Vice News has since learned these pictures may not have been taken in Madaya and has removed them. But everybody seems to be jumping on these images and none of them are real.
Yeah, absolutely. Very few of them are. And I mean, I think what we need to do is to really, what the mainstream media should be doing, which is to investigate the situation before they turn it into this huge theatrical drama that we're seeing unfold, which was very similar, if you remember, to what happened with Yarmouk. And we have to look at the timing of Yarmouk, for instance, which was just before the elections in 2014 when that exploded. Well, I don't need to explain why it was necessary to create a drama at that time. But if you like, I can try and very quickly sort of untangle the propaganda that is being put forward by the mainstream media about Madaya itself.
So who is holding the siege?
It's, again, that's complex, Mike. I'll try and make it as straightforward as I possibly can. Just to begin with, Madaya itself, as you quite rightly say, is north of Damascus. It has about 600 militants in Madaya itself at the moment who come from Ara al-Sham, which is about 60%, 30% al-Nusra, which we know to be al-Qaeda, and 10% Free Syrian Army. Many of these rebels, I have been told, were originally from Madaya itself, which is a Sunni Muslim village, north of Damascus, near Kalamoun, and also very near Zabadani, which is being hotly contested, and that is connected, which I'll come on to. The number of residents has also been massively inflated up to 40,000, I believe, by The Guardian, and some have been saying 30,000. I have been told again that the realistic number is around 23,000. That's been supported by a 2012 population survey that I found. At the start of the conflict, we can say that a percentage of the Madaya civilians supported the rebel incursion and were supporting them purely because they saw it as a way for them to gain independence from the government. Madaya historically has, to some extent, been against the government. So it's not unusual that they have, in some ways, in the beginning of the conflict or the war on Syria, they have supported their own civilians and the rebels, within Madaya. But in recent months, we have actually been seeing videos coming out of pro-Assad protests and demonstrations within Madaya itself. And this is where we should be saying, well, hold on. If this village is anti-Assad, it is basically occupied by Ahrar al-Sham and associates. Why are we seeing anti-Assad demonstrations within this village itself? And why are we seeing videos of villagers actually arguing with the militants that are occupying Madaya, saying, why will you not allow food in? None of these videos have been produced or put out there or published by the mainstream media. The reason we are seeing it is because on the 18th of October, the Red Cross, and this was a statement made by the Red Cross official yesterday, the Red Cross delivered food into Madaya that should have lasted them for 2 months. For 2 months. So that would have taken them up to the end of December, Mike. And what we are seeing are the citizens of Madaya complaining to the militants that they are stockpiling those food supplies. Now, this is something that we've seen them do elsewhere. We saw them do it in Yarmouk. We saw the photographs of fat rebels holding starving babies. So why are the rebels not starving and the people are starving? That's the first question that people should be asking here, because we saw exactly the same propaganda images coming out of Yarmouk. And it's exactly the same system that is happening here. The food is being taken by the rebels that are holding the town. It's being stockpiled. And the inflated prices are down to the rebels. These are the people who live amongst their own people, and they are starving them for propaganda.
So, Vanessa, if we look at this article, for example, in The Guardian today, this is the latest, the Syrian regime to allow aid into besieged, starving town, and the BBC covering the same thing again. If more aid goes in, what's going to happen to that food? It again falls into the hands of the rebels and they simply ramp up prices yet again?
While there is a need for propaganda, that is what will happen, yes. While this propaganda wave needs to be maintained, that is precisely what will happen. And let us also not forget that the UN went into Madaya on December the 28th, 9 days ago, and they evacuated injured fighters, militants, rebels. Are you trying to tell me, is the mainstream media trying to tell me that the UN would go into Madaya, they would evacuate injured soldiers, militants, and they would leave behind starving civilians? Or are you also trying to tell me that in 9 days, people will reach a level of starvation that we are seeing in those photos that we know do not come from Madaya?
So just absolute propaganda.
It's absolute propaganda. I mean, what I would like to do also is to explain the actual siege, because again, there's a lot of confusion. And the mainstream media, The Guardian in particular, yesterday was trying to put across that Hezbollah are involved in the siege. I mean, his way of discerning this is the fact that Hezbollah didn't deny that they were forming part of the siege. For him, in his supreme investigative journalism, this was proof that they were involved in it. The fact is that Madaya, in reality, it has to some extent been under SAA, Syrian Arab Army siege, since August 2015. But again, it's obvious from the Red Cross statement that they have been allowing essential supplies in, which have been being hijacked by the rebel occupation of Madaya, as we've explained. But it's also important to explain the reasoning behind this siege. I mean, siege is always going to be part of a war scenario anyway, to some extent. But the reasons for this siege are incredibly important. You know, we have seen in Kafara and Fua, which are Shia villages in the Idlib province of Syria, an ongoing siege, a full terrorist siege since March 2015. Prior to that, since the beginning of the conflict in 2011, Kafara and Fua have been under partial siege and constant attack. Overall, those villages have lost over 1,700 civilians. 1,700. 300 since March 2015, when they were under full siege and daily barrage from the terrorist hell cannon and starved. The Red Cross again made a very important statement yesterday that none of the mainstream media have picked up on, of course, because it derails their propaganda. They basically said where civilians are in government-held areas, Syrian government-held areas, Assad army-held areas, we never have a problem getting in. The one exception is Deir ez-Zor. However, if they try to get into any of the moderate rebel, in inverted commas, areas, they can't. They are refused entry, not by the Syrian government, not by the Syrian Arab army, by the rebels. So those civilians of Kafira and Foua have been starved pretty much since 2011, relying upon Syrian Arab army bread drops, that's all they were receiving. No medical supplies, no clean water, no warm clothes for over 3 years. They've just been able to extricate 300 families from Kafira and Foua. In Turkey, Iran is brokering negotiations with Ara al-Sham to not only free the civilians of Kafira and Foua and get them out of the siege and their occupation, but also, as you know, recently, rebel fighters from that area have been taken out and deported back to Turkey, where they came from. So these negotiations have been ongoing. However, the Ara al-Sham leaders have been refusing to allow their own rebels to leave Madaya. In fact, when the armed fighters tried to leave Madaya, they were shelled by their own compatriots within Ara al-Sham. Why? Because Zabadani, which has been the hotly contested area, is the Hezbollah stronghold in Syria. It grew up from the Palestinian camps after the 1948 Nakba. It grew from that, evolved into the Hezbollah stronghold. Now, this is where it has to become obvious what the agenda is here. It is Israel that is controlling Ara al-Sham. It is Israel that is saying to Ara al-Sham, you do not leave that area until you have cleansed Zabadani of the Hezbollah camps. Why? Because that ensures Israeli security in the region. That breaks the link between Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon. It undermines the axis of resistance to the imperialist agenda, but also the Israeli agenda in the region. So the Ara al-Sham leadership has had pressure put upon it to keep its fighters in Madaya, to keep the propaganda rolling on the starvation of the civilians of Madaya. And what is happening is that the Syrian Arab army has put Madaya under siege in order to force Ara al-Sham's hand in the negotiations. And we've seen it work. What happened yesterday? The UN suddenly announces that, oh, yes, we can get food into Madaya.
Vanessa, thank you very much for taking us through that. I have so many questions going through my head. What I'd like to suggest live, so we'll see what we can do, but I would suggest that we have another session with you where it's dedicated to having a look at what's happening in Syria around these sieges, and then we can actually go into the detail I know you would like to go into on this one. But just before I come back to you, the other thing in my head was back in the 80s, I think it was about 1981, I visited Mogadishu, Somalia, with a Royal Navy warship. Outside the port were about 50 supply ships with food, which was desperately needed because of the starvation in that country at the time. And during the visit, what we were able to see was the reigning military regime were rebagging principally UN food, grain, and it was then being exported for cash, all on the black market to support these fractious military groups. So different country, but I saw with my own eyes how you end up with a situation where it's out of control. And what you're telling us, of course, is that the real situation not being reported by the mainstream press. Just give you 30 seconds to respond, and then I promise we'll have a look at doing a dedicated session with you if you've got available time over the next few days. What would you like to just close?
Yeah, I mean, in conclusion, and perhaps this is going to seem harsh, but I want to say to people that every time we blindly follow the propaganda path, it leads to bloodshed on scales we cannot even imagine. If we remember Iraq and Libya, where we signed the death warrant of millions and secured the devastation of healthy sovereign nations because we did not question the lies we were being told, these are more lies, and we need to think before we give money to these spurious NGOs that are demanding donations for the starving of Madaya that we know are not starving, because all it does is it puts money into the pockets of regime change agents, drug pushers, child traffickers, mercenaries and killers working for NATO, the US and Israel.
Okay, Vanessa, thank you very much for that update, and I can already see comments in our chat box. People would like to hear you talking in a lot more detail, so we'll do our best to get that fixed up. In the meantime, I hope the weather improves there in France.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's move on to Northern Exposure with David Scott. And David, you're going to tell us, of course, that the weather is a big topic in Scotland at the moment. So the Press and Journal here reporting major floods. And you also provided this picture, which I think has come from a lady posting on Twitter, but it's part of the road running alongside, I think, the River Dee, which is totally collapsed. What can you tell us about the situation at the moment?
Yes, it's been rather wet. Just before we get on to that, a fascinating piece there from Vanessa. One thing which she mentioned, which is of vital importance, is the year 1948. Most of the discussion regarding the situation in the Middle East centres around 1967, 6 Days War and the changes in borders at that point. That's not really the big issue. The big issue is that people were ethnically cleansed from the land, they were driven off the land by fear all around the Middle East in both directions, but the Arab population in what is now Israel was removed from its land, and that land is mostly still empty. It's mostly state-owned, and that is the underlying problem, and that's the problem that is so rarely discussed.
Okay, well, my response to that, David, is yes, another very important issue. Let's see if we can get that debate set up with Vanessa, and I'm sure you would like to join in with your own knowledge of the Middle East and Israel in particular. Okay, let's just return back to matters north of the border.
Yes. Wet, windy Scotland. That's the A93. That's a main trunk road in Deeside, around about Ballater, that has disappeared. There's more gone now. There's about 100 metres of it's completely removed by the river and is now somewhere in the North Sea. We've had quite a lot of rain. It's been described as unprecedented flooding. That's referring to the global warming agenda. It's not unprecedented, it's flooding. That road is in a floodplain, and rivers will do that. It is unusual. If you've got a shot of the castle, maybe, yes, that's the one. This is a Grade A listed castle, which was 60 feet from the river before a week ago, and is now 12 feet from the river, 12 feet being straight down. This is one of Her Majesty the Queen's neighbours. It's next to the Balmoral estate. It's 450 years old, I think, the castle, so it's been there for a while, and the river hasn't bothered it before, but it certainly has now. That's Abergeldy is the name of the castle. Very bonny, and we're currently seeing engineers trying to sort that using the FBR method, which, as I'm sure you understand, Brian, stands for fairly big rocks, which is what they're throwing into the river.
My response to that, David, is you're very lucky, because where the A379 road has subsided, in fact, this was, I think, just about a year ago now. This is to the east of Plymouth, subsidence on a very busy country A road. It's simply sat there with absolutely no effort to repair it. Set of traffic lights causing major disruption. So at least you've got people who can lift and shift rocks in Scotland and get the job done.
Well, but it helps if your neighbours to the Queen, I think.
Okay, it helps if your neighbours to the Queen, as the owners of that castle apparently are. But I believe you also now got snow forecast.
Snow's on the way, yes.
I was cheeky enough to say that this was a picture of a Scotsman stuck in the snow, but you've told me otherwise.
Yes, that's what we call a Hieland coo, Brian. And they're very bonny, quite the most lovely cows in the world. And they're quite good at digging themselves out of snowdrifts, it would seem. We've also lost for a little while Aberdeen Airport. There's a hole appeared in the runway due to flooding, and it's been wet.
Okay. All right. Well, we're all suffering the water at the moment. Let's get on to some of the subjects that have stayed as a thread through our discussions with you. And people are still challenging Theresa May over the position of Eilish Angelini. That it's being alleged that she's still being investigated with regard to her use of public funds for court cases, principally against Robert Greene. But it's small text here. I've put it up in order to show it exists, but this is an email that's been sent to Theresa May. And the point in it is that the person who sent this email got a response where a Miss Gregson informed the person that she was replying on behalf of Theresa May. She says, I'm happy to confirm that the article you refer to is wholly misleading. It is not true that public funds have been misappropriated, and Dame Eilish is not being investigated for misconduct. And then the author of the email has continued, it is my understanding that Audit Scotland are indeed looking into allegations of a secret slush fund of public money within the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, and moreover they are investigating whether Dame Eilish Angelini used public money to pursue a private civil action, and that is ongoing. What can you tell us about this, David?
Yes, very strange response. Lisa Gregson, we haven't managed to find her yet. This person has responded, but when the Home Office was called to try and get in contact with her, they've never heard of Lisa Gregson. So we got this undated letter from someone which may or may not exist. Whether Lisa Gregson's code for "I'm not putting my name to this" or whether she's a real person is yet to be discovered. Now, the article which she referred to, which the alleged Lisa Gregson referred to, which she said was not true, well, we passed that back to the author of that article, Ben Borland of the Daily Express, and he was adamant that he checks all of his sources very thoroughly and that every part of the article was true. Now, we know for a fact that Audit Scotland are investigating a secret unaudited slush fund of public money in the Crown Office, and it's that fund of public money which absolutely, definitely was used by Dame Eilish Angelini to fund her private civil legal action against Robert Greene. That's been confirmed in writing. The nature of the Audit Scotland investigation is that they're looking after the money. They're not investigating whether it was legal to give Angelini the money. They're looking at whether it complies with government auditing and accounting procedures. So what they will have asked the Crown Office is, okay, you're handing out large sums of public money. I mean, we've seen bills that total £50,000, £60,000, and that's not all of it. You're handing out large sums of public money. Where is your policy regarding when and where this is done? That will be the first question. Now, there will have been many more questions because we're now into month 4 of that investigation and they haven't reported yet. We will be watching this one very carefully and we'll report when we know more. But the investigation is ongoing. It absolutely does concern Dame Eilish Angelini and her money which she got from the Scottish state to prosecute Robert Greene in a private civil action. In order to silence him, and this is the person, because this is the substantial matter, this is the person that the Home Office in England has selected as the best possible person from everyone in the United States. In the United Kingdom, we've got 60 million people to choose from. This is the very best person they can get to look after death in custody. Right? Death in police custody, where there's a culture of cover-up and coercion and secrecy. They chose Dame Eilish Angelini. It looks ridiculous.
David, of course, this issue affects Dame Eilish Angelini, goes back to Robert Greene. What are we talking about? We're talking about the Holly Gregg child abuse case. But we've got interesting things happening north of the border at the moment that people are getting very, very upset with what is not happening to do with the Scottish child abuse inquiry. Now, we pointed out on our news yesterday that, of course, Goddard, we've no idea what Goddard is doing south of the border in the so-called inquiry, but we've got Met police officers prepared to tell us that they have no idea what she is doing in her own inquiry. Why are people getting upset north of the border?
Well, it's exactly the same thing. What we've got is a situation where the inquiry was announced in November 2014. So the first 10 months, nothing happened. And then they appointed a person. And then nothing happened. And then they appointed a panel of another 2 or 3 people to advise that person. And what that group have managed to do, it would appear, is utterly lose the confidence of the survivors of child sexual abuse. There are several aspects to this. A lot of it comes back to the government. I mean, there's only so much blame that applies, I think, to the person running the inquiry in Scotland, because really all she should do is resign, because she's been handed terms of reference that basically is a cover-up. Because what they're saying is it's only children who were in full-time residential care. Everybody else abused by teachers, by politicians, by any officer of the state, by people in churches, by people in positions of authority, were not interested. If you go to a school and you're abused in the school, it doesn't matter. It's only if you slept in the school. Now, it's a ridiculous distinction. That's the terms of reference that are applying in Scotland. It's nonsense. It's there to exclude 90% of the cases, or the vast majority of the cases.
Right, David, I've got some newspaper articles here which you brought up, which will take the viewers through this. So we've got the BBC Survivors Organisation threatens abuse inquiry boycott.
Yes, members of the In-Care Survivors Group, INCAS, said the Scottish Government was treating them with contempt. Another organisation, White Flowers Alba, has already indicated that it will take no part in the process. So you can see there the survivors groups are already voting with their feet.
And, well, the comment here, I think, is one of the key ones. This is Susan O'Brien, who's the QC, if I've got this right, heading the inquiry. She says to the Scottish Minister for Education, Angela Constance, it seems to me the matters raised fall squarely within the provenance of discretionary decision-making by government. These are political decisions. I don't wish to comment further. So she's obviously indicating her hands are tied. Who is making sure the inquiry doesn't go where it should do? It's the government. This headline here, I think, is a little bit older, but child abuse survivors slam shambolic inquiry delays. So exactly the same as Goddard.
Yes, this is another headline from 2015 October. It's just to show that this has been rumbling in the background for some time. The government knew that they were losing the confidence of the survivor groups, and they've just not bothered to do anything about it.
Right. So the lady who is in the firing line, here's Angela Constance. We've been a bit cheeky here because we say she scrubs up well, but has been less than effective on child abuse. So she's been in the press for all sorts of things. She thought she was on a recorded interview with the BBC, but was actually live. So that was a bit of an embarrassment. She says that she's confident we've taken the time to allow the chair of the child abuse inquiry to lay the foundations of an inquiry that will allow us as a society to right historical wrongs. So she's trying to say that Ms. O'Brien actually has flexibility in how she's running that child abuse inquiry. Constance here, hang on a minute, just 2 seconds, David, sorry, 2 seconds. Sorry. Just to get the humour in here, of course, we were sent a number of pictures of this lady in her startling outfits. It's a sort of mimic of Theresa May, isn't it? But I was worried about this one because she seems to be waiting for some business. I don't know what was going on there, but what is this woman actually doing to help the child abuse inquiry?
Sorry, to help the child abuse inquiry? No, she does things to help the Scottish fashion industry and shoe manufacture.
Right.
Well, let's just look at what the survivors have said. They said, with an election looming, survivors are surprised that Angela Constance is happy to treat people who have suffered so much with such indifference. That's what she's doing. She's treating them with contempt. She's treating them with indifference. She's not listening, and she's presiding over an inquiry which was brought forward with great reluctance to meet the clamour in 2014 for something to be done. We announced an inquiry. We waited 10 months for the clamour to die down. We then announced the terms of reference of that inquiry, which said, in short, almost all of the abuse we're not interested in. We're going to pick a very small amount of abuse because we can contain that. And then she's moved from there. And I can't imagine she's surprised that the survivor groups are viewing this as a betrayal, because quite clearly that's what it is.
Okay, well, of course, safety of children, as far as the Scottish Government's concerned, what you need for that is the named person scheme. We think this is what Goddard is going to try and bring in. She started a contract for research into how other countries, other Scotland, for example, but also European countries are protecting children. So you've got the named person scheme here, warning. This is quite incredible that they have been, the government has been recruiting taxi drivers basically to spy on people in their cabs in order to protect children. Now, I was really interested with this newspaper article. I'm not sure what paper it's come from, but a few years ago, when UK Column used the term Stasi, we were just over the top. It was outrageous. Now we've got mainstream, to use that horrible expression, calling Stasi. There is a video. There's an audio clip embedded in the named person website where we can hear what's going on. Shall we just play this and then you can comment on that?
Please do.
The main thing that you have to understand is, though, is that if you're contracted out for services to the local authority, you will have a duty, a legal duty, to assist the named person, right? Now, you can imagine the conversations I've been having whilst I've been doing taxi driver training, right? Because we have over 600 taxi drivers, okay, are contracted to the Scottish Borders Council, okay, to transport young children, adults at risk of harm, to various places. And I have to explain to them that if they're covered by the GIRFEC system, or as I said, they're vulnerable young adults and all the rest of it, etc., they as taxi drivers also have a duty to tell us what's been happening. And this idea of what happens in the taxi stays in the taxi doesn't exist anymore. You've got to tell us because it's a legal duty. Where I have the taxi drivers, okay, that I've spoken to, who are contracted to the Scottish Borders Council, they say, oh, it's no your job. And I'm saying, well, it is now, if you've got a contract with the council, okay? If a child tells you something in the actual front seat of the car, okay, or behind you, that this happened last night and all the rest of it, and you're concerned about it, I said to her, I went on to ask, what happens if that happens? What do you do? Where do you go? And a lot of them didn't think to get out of the car at the school and go in and speak to the teachers. I had to explain to them that that was the step that they should take. It's quite interesting, okay, how this is affecting lots and lots of different organisations where you're effectively having to explain to them that passing on information and the duty to assist the named person means that you will have to know about it's quite clear that you can pass on this information.
Now, that's a pretty amazing clip. Before we return to David for comment on it, David had also remembered, of course, that we've seen something with taxi drivers before. This was reported back in 2012. It's Southampton. where they tried to record all conversations in taxis and use CCTV, but the Information Commissioner wasn't having it, and they had to back down. But here we are in Scotland. We're going to use the excuse of children. David, this is very serious, isn't it?
Yes, the numbers. Let's first look at the numbers, right? So that's 600 taxi drivers contracted to one local authority. There are 32 local authorities in Scotland, so that gives us, 19,000 people. But we've already seen that we're looking at other, nightclub bouncers, hairdressers, etc. have been asked to gather information on people. We're going to presumably have everyone who is employed by a local authority and everyone who is contracted to a local authority will be required to act in this way. The number of state snoopers is rapidly approaching the population of the country. It's complete and total information gathering on every child, on every family. That's what it is.
It is, and it's unbelievably serious to the extent I'm almost lost for words when you just put together the pieces. A dictatorship is being assembled under our very noses in UK, and key to a dictatorship, we think of the Stasi, of course, it's get people to spy on each other, get them to tell the tales, which allows the Black Mariahs to turn up at 3 o'clock in the morning. This is where we're heading. Now, you've brought up this gentleman, Jim Terrace, if that's correct.
Jim Terrace, yes. Jim Terrace was the man you were just listening to on that tape. He is Scottish Borders Council Child Protection Committee Training and Development Officer, Jim Terrace.
He's also big into pantomimes, I believe. Now, we couldn't use the photograph of him because that was copyright for the photographer concerned, but there was a report in the Border Telegraph about the pantomime, which I think he'd been involved with. We're just bringing another picture of him here. So this is a very interesting man with an interesting background.
Yes, he was interviewed by a foreign paper at one point, and he was described as a super cop, and his background is quite interesting. He was on the Central Organising Committee of the Scottish Police Federation. Now, the Scottish Police Federation is the trade union for police officers, and he described his position as being on the Politburo. Now, you'll remember, Brian, when Sheiko Bale was killed on the streets of Kirkcaldy, the 9 police officers who were involved first met with the rep from the Scottish Police Federation, and when the commanding officer turned up to find out what had happened, that rep advised them not to talk to their superior officer. So we're looking here at an organisation that is involved in protecting the state officials against scrutiny, against justice, and against inquiry, and operating purely on the basis of what's in the best interest of the officials. They also make sure that the pensions and the pay are to the liking, and that's the area they operate in. So he's coming from the very highest levels of an organisation that protects the interests of police officers against inquiry for, amongst other things, criminal wrongdoing. And advises them not to cooperate with police inquiries. And he's now operating training for the named person scheme in the borders. I would suggest, is it possible that you could have anybody worse in that position?
What interests me, David, is that for the taxi drivers, they are being told that they've got to report. You have got to get the evidence out in order to protect people. But when we come to protect people from the police, the advice from the organisation this man's involved with, we can't say it's from him, but from that organisation, is don't tell, keep your mouth closed. Hypocrisy, duplicity, I'm not sure. Here's the article from the Irish Times. We're great at celebrating defeats around here. Now, this is going back a bit because, of course, we got Mr. Prescott in the picture. But this was the text saying that Mr. Terrace is an unusual man, retired police sergeant, works in child protection services with the local council or representing Unison Union members. So as we always say to people, do your research, check up on what we're reporting and the sources. And you also kindly flagged up for us a little visit to the Police Federation website. Here it is, with a lot on history and the good works they've done for police pay and conditions. And I believe they had a meeting a little while ago, and you taken a little visit into those minutes.
Yes, I was interested to see what they were discussing. And they were discussing pay and pensions, and they were discussing health and safety, and they were discussing protecting people police members who are accused of wrongdoing and representing their interests. It's not that it's inappropriate that you should represent their interests, but it does seem inappropriate that should involve advising them not to speak to lawful authorities, given the position that they put members of the public in. It seems to be two sets of laws, one for us, one for them.
Indeed. So where does this gentleman come into things? We've got Stuart Maxwell, member of the Scottish Parliament, who's been saying, of course, there are no provisions in the 2014 Act that would permit a named person to forcibly vaccinate a child. Indeed, the named person has no powers to compel parents or children to do anything without their consent. Now, I've got the statutory guidance, which you've flagged up, but before I bring that on screen, tell us, who is this man and why should we be interested in what he says?
Well, Stuart Maxwell is one of the true believers in the named person scheme, and the SNP defence, let me just tell you what the opposing line is the named person scheme is one great big hug from the government to every child in Scotland. Nobody can possibly have any qualms about it, and anything that is anything said against the scheme is ridiculous and is a right-wing reactionary Daily Mail Tory-loving plot. That's the SNP position, despite all the other evidence. So they put this forward, I think, without having read very widely on the subject, because so much of what they say is wrong. So either they're knowledgeable and they're lying, or they're simply not well enough read as to what the guidance says. For example, they said that the No to Name Person campaign is being ridiculous because they're talking about the named person getting involved in choosing a child's wallpaper. Isn't that ridiculous? Well, yes, it is ridiculous, but that example came from a government document. The government chose that as an example to tell parents, using language that's suitable for a 7-year-old, because, you might be thick, to tell parents what a named person would do. They talked about how ridiculous it is saying that they get involved in what the child watches on television. Another example from that same government document. So they don't seem to be aware about what their own officials are actually telling people and are actually planning. So Mr. Maxwell here has stated that the named person has no powers to compel parents or children to do anything. Isn't that reassuring, Brian? You might think so. If you go on to the next slide.
Well, let's bring on the rest of it, because you picked up on the statutory guidance here. I'll just highlight where I think you're going to go, because the man at the top says that there's no provisions that would permit a person to be forcibly vaccinated. And then in the statutory guidance, what does it say? The use of compulsion at an early stage may help to ensure compliance with interventions, of which vaccination would be one. And down at the bottom there, including consideration of whether compulsory measures of supervision may be required to meet the child's well-being needs. Is Mr. Maxwell, I'm going to say, is he thick? Is he lying? Or does he simply not have a clue what's going on?
Those are the choices. Thick or lying. We don't know yet. The second one there is worth just reading out in full, because it does illustrate just how pernicious this is. It says the assessment process should follow a national practice model, which provides a framework for practitioners to structure and analyse information consistently. That's the Shinari wheel and the My World triangle and all of this stuff. To understand a child's needs. their strengths and pressures on them, and to consider what support a child might need to improve well-being outcomes, including consideration of compulsory measures of supervision that may be required to meet the child's well-being needs. Now, well-being, remember, is everything, and it's not welfare. And they have made it clear in something that was in, I think, the show just before Christmas. They've made it clear that 2 or 3 low-lying, unconnected worries about something that just doesn't seem quite right, but really on the surface isn't anything very much, taken together can constitute a welfare concern. So someone doesn't like the way that you talk to your child. Someone thinks your child's maybe a bit too fat or too thin or too something. Someone then sees that some of the opinions that that child have don't quite meet the government standard opinions. That's enough. That's a well-being. That could be a welfare concern. We can have intervention. We can have compulsion. We can have anything we like. It's all down to the judgment of the official. So who's in charge? The official, the government, the state. That's what this is about.
And this, of course, is the major point, David, because you've now hit absolutely on it. If we look, that was the right one to put up, Mike. You can let that one run. If you look at the quality of the people that we are supposed to trust, here we've got a midwife from Newmarket. Is that how you pronounce it?
Well done. Yes, Newmarket. Yeah.
Found guilty of by the Nursing and Midwifery Council of drugging expectant mothers. The result of this was she got her way, and they had, I think, caesareans instead of natural births. We've got this one, a newspaper article about the grotesque greed of the public sector fat cats. You brought in these two. So we've got the Herald Scotland council boss suspended amid row over 200,000 taxi contracts to his nephew. That'd be a good one, wouldn't it? You're in a taxi where they're spying on your children. And of course, it's a taxi owned by the nephew of the very council running the spying operation. This is serious stuff. Should a parent give up their responsibilities to bring up their own children into the hands of people who are showing that they're full of sleaze and unreliability? Somebody said in the chat room, it's frightening. I think this is a frightening scenario.
That's exactly it, because the named person scheme only makes any sense at all if you take certain premises. One, you have to view every child as a potential victim. Every child is now viewed by the Scottish Government as vulnerable or potentially vulnerable, which means you have to view every parent as abusive or potentially abusive. And you also have to view every state official as perfect, as an angel, as a paragon of virtue. And you have a look at them, and they're not. They have this midwife seemed to be drugging pregnant women to hurry along labour because she didn't like the fact that labour took too long, and obviously she had other things to be doing. We don't know what, maybe watching, television or something, I don't know. But she needed a way, the clock was running and she hurried things along. It seems that she hasn't actually killed anybody, but that's more by good luck than good guidance. And then we've got all the greed, we've got corruption, there's endless numbers of sexual crimes. I mean, for example, there's already been a named person who's had to be placed on the sex offenders register due to an unnatural sexual interest in children. And that's what the state is made up of. Yep. And yet we're meant to say that these people are having control and power over our families. It's quite a situation, Brian.
Serious stuff. Now, David, watching the clock at the moment, you were keen to get on to in-depth and what sort of systems coming into the country. We are, of course, very interested in that, but I think we're going to just hold that for another time. So, but what I'll just bring up on...
If I could just put one, just to finish off that piece and just to allude to where we're going to go, if I can give you one, if I can find it quickly. Yes. One quote. This is from Friedrich Hayek in The Road to Serfdom. He said, the word truth itself ceases to have its old meaning. It describes no longer something to be found within the individual conscience as the sole arbiter of whether, in any particular instance, the evidence or the standing of those proclaiming it, warrants a belief. It becomes something to be laid down by authority, something which has to be believed in the interest of unity and of the organised effort, and may have to be altered as the exigencies of the I'm sorry about that.
That's fine. That's fine.
Of the organised effort require. That gets to the nature of what we're dealing with in the named person.
Okay.
Truth is now a government-defined thing. The whole of life becomes a government-defined thing because the whole of the moral code by which you live has to be defined by the government. Otherwise, how can named persons stand watching over families and decide, godlike, when to intervene and when not to?
David, we're absolutely going to get into the area, and I know you've got some really very powerful other quotes to go through. We've just got a couple of minutes to run to the top of the hour, so let's very quickly just run through what we intended to cover, but I think it's worth having a look at. I'm just going to remind people that UK Column has been warning about the role of this organisation, Common Purpose. Everywhere we've seen Common Purpose get into the public sector, we've started to see breakdown, whole change in the management style, bullying. We've seen the fraud and corruption coming in. It can be no accident. If you get onto UK Column website, you can read the articles. If you're interested in the NHS, look for Towards a Million Change Agents. Here's the latest one, Leadership Training for a Common Purpose. But I'd give you 30 seconds on Scottish Police, and then I just would like to end by encouraging people to have a look at a video of a talk by Dr. Andrew Wakefield. But here, David, is your new Chief of Police Scotland, and apparently this man is saying, let's get those armed police onto the streets. Is that correct?
Yes, I'd like to come back and do Police Scotland in more detail. I think as a 30-second summary of Police Scotland's new boss, I would give you what I would term, and maybe after Alex has introduced a weekly book review, we should have a weekly word in Scots. I think that'd be quite good. Brian, I can teach you one word in Scots a week, something relevant. And in honour of the new Police Scotland boss, this week's word in Scots is bletherskite. And bletherskite means someone given to voluble, empty talk and nonsense. It comes from the Old English skite, which means diarrhea, in this case verbal, which in turn comes from the Old Norse skitter, which means excrement. So maybe next week, Brian, I can expand on why that's appropriate.
Okay. All right, David, thank you very much for that. Well, just to end on a serious note, I have to get the smile off my face just to finish this main point. Of course, we've heard from you the dangers of the named person scheme in Scotland, and the fact that scheme will be telling parents what they can and can't do. There's no doubt about that. It's in the legislation. And one of the things that will be compulsory, of course, is to get your child vaccinated. I just encourage people to have a look at this video. I have still not seen all of it, but it's Dr. Andrew Wakefield giving a talk about autism and mandatory vaccinations. And in that video, he's quoting real information, real statistics. Here's the exponential growth in autism. And what he's pointing out is if this continues, I think by something like 2045, 50% of children in the US will suffer from autism. So if I was a parent with children who were still to be vaccinated, I'd be paying close attention to what this man says, and I'd certainly be paying close attention to the government telling me what I should and should not do for the best interests of my children. David,
I would just add very briefly, Brian, the book, Andrew Wakefield is very worthwhile listening to. Also, he's written a book called Callous Disregard, which is excellent.
Okay. David, thank you very much for that. I am, of course, very willing to add Scots to my limited linguistic vocabulary. I can manage a wee drammy at the moment, but I'm happy to learn more. We'll say to everybody, thank you very much for joining us. We can tell that the information that UK Column is putting out is now really starting to hit home as people see how quickly and how serious the pieces are coming together. The Lib, Lab, Con, all of the mainstream parties are working for a fascist state. We could debate that. We will debate the exact form. But of course, organisations like Common Purpose using NLP for political purposes in the background, extremely dangerous. Can we stop it? The answer is yes. The first thing we've got to do is keep people on a reasonable basis, talking together, swapping information, protecting each other. We do not want violence. We don't want rhetoric for violence. Anybody that's in UK at the moment is in the same boat. Consider it the island, a life raft. We need to work together. But truth and evidence extremely important. So UK Column is going to encourage people to take our information with your own research and pump it out everywhere you can get it, because people need to know north of the border, south of the border, wherever. We do what we do not to provide an entertaining show, but in order to get the evidence across so that you can personally take action to deal with what's going on. As you can see, in 2016, things are really speeding up. There is much more worse stuff to come. We know about that. But if we're forewarned and forearmed, we can do something about it. Okay, that's it from us. Thank you very much for joining us. If you like what we do, consider making a donation or taking out a subscription. We'll be back same time on Monday. Bye-bye.